Let us do this. We're in today's Daf in Masechet Chullin is Daf Lamed Aleph 31, and we're at the bottom of Lamed Amud Bet, and we're continuing this parak, which is sort of going into more detail about what kind of shechita is kosher, what kind of shechita is not kosher. Obviously, as we've said earlier in the Masechta, all of this is based on Kabbalah, right? There's none of this is based on explicit psukim. Yesterday we had a reference in a pasuk in Yirmiyahu about shechita and the arrow, and we learned something about the nature of a knife from the arrow. But obviously, it's all very secondary kind of limudim, if not more than that. Today, we get into a very interesting question. And we talk about using an arrow itself for shechita. So very interesting. You often think you have to use a knife, but what if you use an arrow? What if you shot an arrow at the neck of an animal? The bird would be a lot easier than a large animal, and you were able to use the sharp point of the arrow that cut across the simanim. So if you're very good with the shot, you can do that. So says the Gemara, 3 lines in the bottom of Lamed Amud Bet, Rava havi badik legira the Rabbeinu bar Tachlifa. Rava would check the arrows for Aviona B'Tachlifa because you got to check the knife before you do shechita. So if you're going to use your arrows and shoot a bird, right, you have to check the arrow beforehand. So Rava would check the shachat ba'ofa, and he would shecht a bird with the arrow behadi deparach while it was flying in the air. So they were very, very skilled, I guess. They would have birds. I don't know how you do this, but they would shoot these arrows at the birds and cut across the neck while they're flying, and that's a kosher shechita. Says the Gemara, well, it sounds like a great shechita, but you didn't see the arrow going into the bird. You couldn't have seen it. Doma avid chalada. Maybe it went in instead of going. Remember, the shechitas come from the outside to the inside. Maybe the arrow went straight into the inside of the neck and cut outwards. So how do you know it's kosher? You can't see it. Says the Gemara, well, no, you can see it because you find the bird. That's why you're shechting it, right? And chazinan gidfi, turn the page, the lamed aleph, the mifarmi, right? You see the gidfi, the basically the skin essentially, or the feathers on the neck of the bird that are mifarmi means they're parum, they're opened up. So you can actually see from the way it's slaughtered whether the arrow went to the outside or went through the inside. If it went through the inside, then the outside is not necessarily cut through. So anyways, you could see. If you can't see, it's not kosher. That's smart. That's a great strategy to shoot your birds. Habai kisui. Remember, you have to cover the blood of a bird that you shot, like a chayan and oaf. You have to cover the blood. So how do you cover the blood? The chitim, the mechasileyan, what's the big deal? When the bird falls down to the earth, you find the blood and you cover it. But Amar Reb Zera Marav is quoted as saying that Hashochet tzarich shitain afar lamata afar lamala. When you shech the bird or a large animal and you do kisoy adam, you have to have dirt below the place where you shecht it and above. How can you shecht in the air when you don't know where it's going to fall? Shnamar, that's based on the pasuk which says kiso be'afar, cover the bird's blood or the animal's blood with dirt. Afar lo nemar elo be'afar, it has to be inside the dirt, meaning dirt has to be above and below it. So how can you shech the bird in flight, right? When it's going to fall down, sure, when it falls, you'll find it and you cover the blood, but you have to put dirt underneath it. Answers the Gemara, well, it's not like they were shooting birds out in the wild desert. It was in a confined area, right? They had shooting ranges. Come and shoot your bird for lunch. And so dimazmin la'afar dekula pitka, they would prepare the dirt for the entire valley, meaning they would say, Tosis would bother, like, what does it mean? What does you have to say? Is there dirt or not dirt? But they would make sure that there's dirt available in this whole area where you're shooting the birds. Wherever the bird fell, it would fall on some earth, and then you would cover it, and you'd be kosher for kisoy. And so, very, very beautiful case where you can use an arrow basically to do shechita of a bird. Okay. I don't know if you try this at home. It sounds like it's probably be very hard to learn this skill, but we can all practice. Continues the Gemara now up to 2 dots on Lamed Aleph and Aleph. The Mishnah said, a very interesting thing in the Mishnah was that, remember, you're not supposed to chop the head of the animal off, right? That would be called drisa. But let's say you're shechting and you're doing it like you're supposed to, and the head falls off, meaning your knife is so sharp it goes straight through it, and the whole head of the animal comes off. So the Mishnah said that as long as there's extra of your knife outside of the area of shechita, you're kosher, right? That's what the Mishnah said. Hayishochet v'itiz. The Mishnah said as long as there's extra knife, the knife is the length of the tsavar of the animal, of the neck. Amar Rebbe Zera, said Rebbe Zera, what that means is melot savar chutz savar. That the knife is, let's say again, the neck of the animal is 6 inches wide. It means the knife has to be 6 inches like the neck of the animal, and 6 more inches of the equivalent size outside of the neck of the animal. So in that case, if your knife was 12 inches long, then we assume that as you go through it, you're getting the whole thing, and you're not worried that you're putting downward pressure too much. It's not drisa. It's considered to be a kosher shechita. Now, oh, sorry, I sort of gave away the answer. Let me read that in the Gemara first. Ibailu. So they asked Rabbi Zera, right, or they asked in front of the Chachamim, when we say melot savar v'chutz savar, when it says the knife has to be the length of the neck and outside of that, does that mean outside of that kimelot savar, like I just explained, that the length of the neck and double that? To havili trey savari, it has to be equal to 2 times the neck. O dilma melot savar v'chutz savar mashu. Or do you mean it has to be the neck and a little bit more? So does it have to be 7 inches in this case of a neck that's 6 inches or 12 inches? So Tashma, let's come and prove it from the further part in the Mishnah. The Mishnah continued and said, right? Let's say you get 2 heads at once. So you shecht an animal and you cut off you're shechting 2 animals. You got one long knife, or it doesn't have to be at the same time, right? But the same action of shechita, the knife can go into one and then into the other, and the heads just cut right off. You don't go back and forth at all. So says the Mishnah, Im yesh l'sakin melod savar echad kasher. If the sakin is as long as one neck, it's kosher. Now, what does that mean? One neck. My melod savar echad. What does it mean as wide as one neck of the animal? Ilay my melod savar echad v'tulo. If it means that it just has to be the width of a neck of one animal, say again, in this case, 2 animals, each one 6 inches, it has to be 6 inches, that can't be. Hashna bebehema achat, when you had one animal, we said in the first part of the Mishnah, that you need malot savar and chutzlat savar, right? You need the neck and outside. So you can't say with 2 animals, one neck is fine. The shtei behaimot sagile kimalot savar echad. Elapshita, what it means is melot savar chutz l'shnei savarim. What it means is that you need to have a knife that's at least as wide as each of the necks. So again, 6 inches and 6 inches, you need 12 inches, plus another neck outside of that. And so basically, this sort of proves to you that when we say you need extra space outside of the neck, it means the extra space equivalent to the width of a neck. And so, shmamina, melot savar, chutz l'savar, shmamina. So when you say outside of the neck, it means this area of outside of the neck. So for example, again, to make it concrete, if there's one animal and its neck is 6 inches, you would need at least a 12-inch knife for this to be kosher if when you shechted, it came off in one fell swoop. And if it was 2 animals together, and each one was 6 inches, you would need a knife that is 6, and one more neck, meaning 18 total. And that's, again, if you cut and kill in one motion. If you're going back and forth the way you're supposed to be, then the knife could be much smaller than that, right? It doesn't have to be the width of the whole neck of the animal. Now, b'medvar memurim, this is what our Mishnah then continued and said. When is it true that you need the knife to be this big? We're halfway down. Oh, not quite. I wish 2 dots around 20 lines down on Daf, Lamed Aleph, Lamed Aleph. B'medvar memurim said the Mishnah that you need to have a knife that's this big. Bisman sheholich v'lo hevi. If you go in one direction and not come back, but if you go back and forth, we said even a karnayim, right? And I translated karnayim in the Mishnah as like, I forget how I said it, like a very sharp knife, a scalpel, is how mine said it, but very, very sharp, right? It says Rav Menashe, what we mean is an ismo she'ein lo karnayim. Sorry, the Mishnah said ismo, not the word karnayim. The word ismo. So what we mean, says Rav Menashe, is an ismo that doesn't have karnayim. Karnayim literally mean horns, but it means it doesn't really have things on the outside, doesn't have like decorative areas, which sometimes you'd have on a knife. That would be a problem because since it's so small, if there's stuff on the outside, then because you're going back and forth and back and forth, it might catch on the things on the outside and actually tear the neck and cause a psul. So when you're talking about a very small knife, it has to be a clean knife. Amar le Rav Acha Breid Rav Asher Menashe, Rav Avia, sorry, Rav Menashe. Said Rav Acha Breid Rav Avia to Rav Menashe, Machtamai. What about a needle, right? So now a needle is, of course, a very, very small knife, essentially, because it's got just the tip of a sharp point. It's not something you can go back and forth with, but you can stab multiple times with the needle, right? So is a needle something that it can be used for shechita if you go in many times? Amalei said, no, it's not. You can't really use a needle because machta mivza baza. A machta pierces. It doesn't cut. It makes a hole, but you can't say that's a cut. It's not. You need a tiny little knife but a point is not a knife. So a machta would not be kosher for shechita, again, even if you stab the animal's neck 20 times and altogether made it a rove. What about machta de ushkafi? Now, machta de ushkafi, I don't have pictures, I don't know if someone does, but a machta de ushkafi is translated as a machta of a shoemaker, a cobbler. And those, when shoemakers use needles, right, what we call it a needle, they were basically a flat piece of metal, I guess they would use or whatever they had, and the sides were very sharp, right? So you go in and get under the shoe, basically. So there, Mai, is that considered, excuse me, to be something that can be used for shechita? Again, these are very technical issues, but it's because the sides are sharp, and so is that something you think you could cut with, essentially? So what about a machta de ushkafi? Amarle, so he answered, Rav Menashe answered, Rav Acha Tanina, well, our Mishnah said, Afilu kolsho, right? Our Mishnah gave a list and said you can use a tiny thing, an ismo, anything. So now, clearly, whenever we use extra words, we're trying to include extra things. So what are we adding with afilu kolsho? My love, machta ushkafi. It must be that we're adding even this kind of small needle which has sharp sides. And so we're no isma, we're adding a scalpel, which is a very small, sharp knife. Says Gemara, but in ismo, behind your katanila. Well, the Mishnah said ismo, right? How can you say that we're saying an ismo plus everything else means also an ismo? Answers Rav Acha, sorry, Rav Menashe, Perushika Mefarish. It's possible that or the Gemara maybe, the Mishnah is just explaining what we mean. My kol shehu ismo. That when we say you can do anything, we mean anything, meaning like an ismo. And Hachanami Mistavra, this makes a lot more sense when you read the Mishnah consistently, because the Isav Gedaitek Machta de Ushkafi, right? If a Machta de Ushkafi, which again is a very small kind of needle that has just sharp sides, but it's not really a cutting knife. If that was kosher, then I would read the Mishnah. I would know Hashta Machta de Ushkafi Sharia. If a Machta de Ushkafi, which is a needle of the shoemaker, is kosher, then ismo miboy. You have to tell me about an ismo, which is it's a knife. It's just a very small knife. So what would be the chiddush, right? Meaning, if you're saying you can do even a smaller thing, why tell me even a larger knife? Says Gemara, not necessarily, because ismot strichale, as we mentioned earlier, they made different kinds of these ismos, of these scalpels. I would have thought ligzar ismol she'ein lo karnayim atu ismol she'yesh lo karnayim, because many ismos were made with side pieces, side decorations. Again, what we're calling horns on the side, and we said that's puzzle, right? If your small knife has decorative things on the side, then as you cut through with it, it will cause ripping of the animal's simanim, and it's puzzle. So you might think you make a gezerah that because this instrument is often not kosher, we shouldn't allow you to use it. Kamash Mulan, that we don't make that gezerah, meaning if it doesn't have karnayim, it's okay to use. If it does have karnayim, of course, it would be pasul, um, and therefore, Kamash Mulan, that it's kosher only if it doesn't have karnayim. So that is the next halacha of what size knife you need. Continues our next Mishnah, moving right along. Sorry, let me just find my place. Which is it's a long daf today. So next Mishnah, which is a little more than halfway down on daf Amid Aleph, is the question, which we've actually discussed this in many different ways, which is what kind of intention do you need when you do shechita, which is of course a question for many, many acts that people do. Says our Mishnah, and we're going to discuss those in the Gemara. Nafla sakin v'shachata. If you drop a knife and not intentionally, you're not cutting, the knife goes down and it cuts across the neck of an animal. Right? Says the Mishnah, even if everything was done fine, there was a camera there, you were watching it, it went sliced right across the neck of the animal. It wasn't drisa, it didn't fall on the neck. You dropped it and it came across the animal somehow, just imagine the case. It doesn't matter, psula, it's still pasul. Pasuk that we use for zvicha says you shecht it and you can eat it. You have to have intentionality in zvicha. You can't have accidental svicha of an animal. Says the Gemara, okay, now time de nafla. This implies it's because the knife fell, right? The knife fell, let's say your elbow hit the knife, it's on the ledge of your deck, and the knife fell and killed an animal below. Ha hit bilahu. Let's say you dropped the knife, then it would be kosher, right? Now we think that means even if you didn't intend for the knife to shech the animal, but you were dropping knives, you were throwing knives, or you were practicing target practice or something, but you intentionally threw the knife as opposed to it falling, that would be kosher. even though what it implies is afagav de lo mechavein. Even though you didn't intend to do shchita, you just intended to move the knife. So remember, there's different levels of intention. It could just be accidental. Your elbow bumped it and it fell. You didn't want it to fall. You could intend for it to fall, but not know that it's going to kill an animal or not want it to kill an animal. Or you can, of course, drop it or throw it in or shoot an arrow, like we said earlier, with the case of the chitzim. So that would obviously be very intentional. So our mission implies that if you drop it by accident and shecht, it's not kosher. But if you dropped it on purpose without the intention to shecht, but you wanted to drop it or you wanted to throw it, it would be kosher. So man tana de lo ba'inin kavanah l'shchita, who is the Tana of our Mishnah, which we now think implies that he holds that you don't need intention for the act of shechita. You need intention for the act of throwing the knife, but not for intention for the act of shechita. Marava Rabbi Natani. This is Rabbi Natan, and of course, this is familiar to all of us from the beginning of the Masechta. The Tani Oshaya Zira de Min Chavraya. Oshaya, the youngest in the group, told us. It was a nickname that he had, according to some, right? Oshaya Zira de Min Chavraya. It's a very cute nickname. He was the youngest of the Chevra. He's taught us Zarak Sakin the Noatzabekoto. Let's say you throw a knife because you want to shoot it at a wall, right? You're playing target practice, or you just want to store your knives in the wall, and you're practicing throwing the knife against the cork. Or you're going to be in the circus next week. And says Rabbi Shaia's case, and it goes and it shechs the animal on its way, meaning while it's traveling towards the wall, the animal walks by and shechs right across the neck of the bird. Rabbi Natan Machshir, Rabbi Natan said that's kosher because even though you had no intention for shechita, you intended to throw it. And Chachamim poslim. So this is the Tan of our Mishnah, must be Rabbi Natan. Hu Tanila. And so he said this over, who Amarla and Rabbi Oshai, Rabbi um, Rava said that, I think, and he responded to him and said, halacha Rabbi Natan, that in fact this is the halacha like Rabbi Natan. Okay, says the Gemara, Veha Amra Rava Chadas Imna, but Rava already said this one time that the halacha is like Rabbi Natan. This is a discussion we had in the beginning of the Masechta. This time, our first Mishnah in the Masechta said, "Kulam sheshachatu v'acherin ro natan shchitatan kshera." Right? Our Mishnah said, remember, Cheres, Shota, and Katan cannot do shchita on their own because we don't think they necessarily know what they're doing. But if they do shchita and other people are watching them and making sure they do it correctly, then the shchita is kosher. V'amrina, and so we said back on Daf Bet, Man Tana de lo bai kavan l'shchita. Who's the Tana who says you don't need to have intention? Because we assume that a katan or a cheresh or shota cannot have intention, right? They're not mature enough or with it enough to have that intention. They can do an act, but they can't have intention. And we said, who is that who says you don't need kavanah for shchita to be kosher? V'amar Rava Rabbi Natani. And Rava told us then it's Rabbi Natan. So Rabbi Natan keeps, popping up with Rava's statement, but if you learn Daf Yomi, you know Daf Bet. So what do you need to tell us again? Answers the Gemara Tzricha. We need to say it because it's two different cases, right? That case was a minor, and this case was essentially a case of a person throwing a knife without necessarily intention to shchita at all, right? There, think about it. There, you have a katan, let's say, or a shota, or a cherish, right? And they intend to do shchita, but they're not bardat. So there, you might think, yes, if you only told us that it's kosher by a katan, I would say mishum kamechavin mishum chaticha ba'olam. The kid wants to cut the neck of the animal. We assume they don't have the understanding to know what shchita is. Here, you didn't even mean to cut anything. You're throwing a knife at a wall. So maybe that's not enough. And if you told us only here, when you threw the knife at the wall, you could say, look, I'm sure the person didn't intend to do shchita, but a person with dat, a person with what we consider to be dat, wanted to throw the knife and cause the effect. There, the act wasn't even happening by a person who's a bendat. So maybe emalo, maybe that can never be converted into a kosher shchita, even if someone's watching them. Kamash tzricha, and therefore Rav had to quote Rabbi Natan in both cases, or the Mishnah had to quote Rabbi Natan in both cases to tell us that both cases you don't need intention for shchita, you need intention for the act, but you don't need intention for shchita. So it would be kosher according to Rabbi Natan in both cases. Itmar says the Gemara, while we're on the topic, we're going to get into a little sidetrack here, which is a lot of fun, of intentionality in actions. And the question comes up with the question of tefillah. We're going to see in today's daf that it's really complicated. So A person is tameh for whatever reason. We'll see why. There are many possible reasons. They go into a mikvah. It's not always the case that that act of going to the mikvah makes them tahor. There are times, and we'll see what they are, where you need to have intentionality that I'm going into the mikvah to become tahor in order for it to count. If you go into a mikvah by accident, it may or may not count. So says the Gemara, let's talk about a nida. Right? A nida is tameh when she becomes a nida. She's a, let's say not tameh. She's a nida. I'll start with that. And in order to become mutar to her husband, right, she has to go to a mikvah at the end of her nida period. Let's say she nida shene'ensa v'tavla. Let's say she doesn't want to go to the mikvah or whatever reason, she's scared of water, whatever it might be, and she is forced. So she's compelled to go into the mikvah against her will. Someone pushes her off the bridge, is the case we always think of, right? Or pushes her into the ocean. And she goes into the mikvah and she's tovel. Says Rav Yehuda Marav, Tahora lebeita. Look, she's not a nida anymore. She can go home, sleep with her husband. Her status of nida is ended. But asura lechal betruma. She's not allowed to eat truma because in order to eat truma, if she's a wife of a Kohen, right, or daughter of a Kohen, so in order to eat truma, you have to have intentionality when you do the tefillah that I'm doing the tefillah to become tahar to eat truma. And since she didn't have that, she's not allowed to eat truma. That's Rav Yehuda Rav's opinion. And Rabbi Yochanan says, Afla beita lo tahara. She can't even go home. She's not kosher from being a nida. She has to go to the mikveh again on purpose. Okay. Now, so that's the basic machloket. Amalei Rav Nachman. Now, Rava later, a couple generation later, said to Rav Nachman. Now, the Rav, I don't understand. Rav says to Horela Beita Vasura Lechol Betruma that the mikveh counts for not making her nida anymore, but she can't eat truma. I don't get it. A nida sleeping with her husband is an isser of karet. A person who's tamei eating truma is an isra of mita b'dei shamayim, which is lower level. So I don't get avon karet hatarta. You've permitted her from the isra of karet of nida, but isur mita mibay, but a lower level isur of mita b'dei shamayim, you're prohibiting her for. Amrullah, he said to him, it's not a question of how strict the prohibition is. It's chulin and kachim. Bala chulin, who her husband is a civil matter, and chulin lo by kavana. In order to become tahar for chulin, so for sleeping with her husband in case of anida or other people eating foods that are not kachim, that you don't need kavana. But for kachim, you need kavana. So the issue is not that it's karet or mitabi shamayim, it's whether it is chulin or kachim. So that's the big question about intention. Ask the Gemara, we are last words, three lines on the bottom. Uminat timra. How do you know that in fact there is a halacha that differentiates between chulin and kachim in regards to intentionality of tefillah? It's not. So we get a Mishnah in Mikvaot, which, like a lot of these Mishnayot, we've been quoting a lot of Mishnayot from Taharot. They are impossible Mishnayot. So this Mishnah Mikvaot says a really interesting halacha. Let's say a person, I think setting up the case, I'll set it up this way. A person is sitting at the side of the ocean, right? And he is tameh, and his kalim are tameh. So he goes to the ocean and he wants to go into the mikvah, basically is the ocean. We'll see if he wants it or not. He sits down to make his picnic, and he's got all his plates, which are tameh, and him, who's tameh, and he's not wearing any clothing, so that's an important detail. And he's sitting on the side of the ocean, right? And a huge wave comes, and washes over him, and the wave contains 40 sa'ah. I'm going to simplify the Gemara just because of the nature, and so basically it's a movable mikvah. It's not exactly, but so what does the Mishnah say? Gal, you have a wave, shenitlash, which separated from the ocean, so it's not attached to the ocean, right? But the wave itself that comes washing over him, bo arba'im sa'ah. It has 40 sa'ah. So basically, it's a mikvah that's falling onto the guy. Minafal al hadam v'alakilim, and it falls on a person and on his pots. Taharim, they all become tahar because they were all in a mikvah, or the mikvah was in them, basically. It's encircled them. Now, says the Mishnah, says the Gemara, sorry, that's the Mishnah. My love, adam dum yav kilim. It implies that a person in this case is like the pots. Ma kilim to go mechavni. Right? Obviously, if you ask a pot or a shirt, do you want to become tahar? It does not tell you I have kavanah to become tahar. Right? The water just fell on the shirt. So since that was enough, afadam nami labai kavanah. So too you see by regular issues of chulin, because this Mishnah is not necessarily referring to kachem, you don't need kavanah. If you accidentally get wet and it's 40 sa, you become tahar. Says, well, how can you prove that from the Mishnah? Mimai. How can you say that? Dilma Yoshev Mitzapaskinan. Maybe this guy is sitting there in order for the wave to come. He's like, I don't want to dump in the water. This water's coming to me. I'll wait for a big wave and I'll be sitting right here. Maybe he's intentionally doing it. Right? When is this wave going to come and wash over me and turn to Lamed Aleph and Bet? And Kelim Dumya da Adam. Maybe it's the opposite. The only reason his shirt becomes tahar and his pots become tahar is because he, the owner, is sitting there with his pots and his shirt waiting for the water to come. Kelim Dumya da Adam. Ma Adam bin kavana. Maybe the assumption is that a person needs kavana even for chulin, like Rabbi Yochanan said. And af kelim nami become chavin leila Adam. The kelim also, of course, kelim can't have kavana on their own, but their owner can have kavana. So maybe the owner of these kelim has to say, I want these things to become tahar with the wave that's about to fall. So how can you prove it? Now you're going to say, well, if that's the case, then what's the chiddush? This seems like a great strategy. If you're sitting there waiting for the water to come, and the water comes and it's 40 sa'ah, of course you're tahar. Why do you need a Mishnah to tell me that? Says where? Because I might have thought you might make a gzera because if you have a chardulit, I'm going to call it chardulit like a waterfall of rainwater, that's not kosher. So it's a very complicated halacha mikvaot that if rainwater, meaning directly from the rain, it just fell, it hasn't sat in a pool basically, falls on you, it's not a mikvah. A mikvah is complicated, but a mikvah is a contained body of water. If a contained body of water washes over you, then you're tahar. But if rainwater washes over you, you're not tahar. So you might have thought ligzar mishum chardulit shegishamim. We should make a gzera because of the what's it called, waterfall of rain. Inami ligzar rashina tu kipin, or maybe you should worry about the top of the wave, which is the water part, atu kipin, because of the kipin, which means like the inside, the arc of the wave, where it's dry. So you might think actually you don't become tahar if you're inside the wave. You only become tahar if the wave touches you. The chiddush is that we don't make that gzera. Asking her, what are you talking about? This top of the wave, inside the wave. How do you know? How do you know that you can't become tovel within the area, the water, the surface, sorry, the air within a wave? Meaning, if a wave washes over you, maybe you're tahar because you were physically inside the wave, even if it didn't touch you. How do you know that's not an issue of tahara? It's not because the Mishnah says that. You can be tovel in the head of a wave, meaning the water part of a wave. You can't be tovel in the airspace of the wave, the arc of the wave, because you can't be tovel in something that's just air, even though technically you're inside the wave, right? People who ride surfboards, they're inside the wave. You might say, I'm contained within a mikvah, basically. Says the Mishnah that doesn't count. Anyways, it's a very side and interesting halacha about mikvaot. But the point from this Mishnah is that maybe we can't prove from here whether the wave that washed over this person was mitaher him without his intention. It might be that he wanted the wave to come. So how do we know? So it says the Gemara now, El Chulin de loboy kavana minalan. What is the proof that by chulin you don't need to have intention when you become tahor? We are like 8 lines or 10 lines down from the top of Lamed Aleph Amud Bet. Says Gemara Ditznan, it's another Mishnah. This Mishnah is in Masechet Machshirin. Again, another complicated Mishnah in Taharot, which the Mishnah says the following: Peirot shnaflu toch amat hamayim. Let's say a person's fruit fell into a water. Amma is like how do you translate it in English? Like a container of water. Okay, that's not a container, a stream of water, right? An amma is a stream of water. So your fruit fell into the stream of water. It could be a man-made, like an irrigation ditch. Upashat mi sheyadav tmeot v'natzlan. If a person put their hands into the water to pick up the fruit, and that person is tameh, his hands are tameh, and he takes them out, yadav taharot, that person's hands are tahar because he put them into a running stream of water that contains 40 sa'ah, or maybe not, whatever, he put them in a stream of water. Peirot eno b'chiyutan, but the fruits are not considered to be mikabel tuma. Remember, fruits are only mikabel tuma when you want them to get wet. Here, the fruit fell in by accident. You didn't want the fruit to fall into the water, so therefore the fruit's not mikabel tuma. However, in bishvil sheyudchu yadav, if a person stuck his hands into the water to wash them out, because he said, my hands are dirty, I want to use this water to wash my hands, then his hands are taharot because he put them in the water. But the perot are bechiyutan, then because he wants the water, he wanted it for his hands, but since he wants the water to be flowing there, it touched the fruits, and the fruits are mikabel tuma. So what do you see from here? That basically, we think, that you put your hands in the water without the intention of being washed out, right? That was the first case, and they become tahar. So you see that even if you accidentally go into a mikvah or accidentally put your hands into water, they become tahar when it's talking about chulin. That was the proof. Asked Rava to Rav Nachman, Eitvei Rava to Rav Nachman, what about the following Mishnah? There's a Mishnah in Masechet Chagiga which says, Taval lechulin. Let's say a person went to a mikvah in order to become, saying, to allow him to eat chulin, right? Remember, chulin, you don't need to be tahar to eat chulin, but many people were makbid to eat chulin, what's called al taharat kodesh, right? So a person went to a mikvah to eat chulin, and huchsak lechulin, and he was, assumed that he's allowed to eat chulin, asur lemaser. But if he didn't have intention that I'm going to the mikvah to become pure to eat maaser, he's not allowed to eat maaser. Now, the interesting words of this Mishnah are huchzak the chulin, which is that he went into the mikvah for chulin and he's confirmed to allow chulin, which implies you have to have intention even for chulin. Huchzak in lo, huchzak lo. Only if you intended and said, I want to become tahar for chulin, let's say you just jumped into water to go swimming, you wouldn't become tahar. Answers says Rav Nachman, Hachkikamar. No, what the Mishnah means to say is, not that you have to have intention for chulin. If you jump into the water, you become tahar for chulin automatically if it's without intention, but you are still asur to maaser unless you go to the mikvah with the purpose of becoming tahar for maaser. Eitvei. Okay, what about the following Mishnah, which is that same Mishnah in Chagiga? Mishnah says, Taval v'lo huchsak. Let's say you go into a mikvah, but you don't make a chazakah, right? Let's say that you are tahar. So then kilo lo taval, it's as if you never went into the water. Now, what does that mean? You didn't have a chazakah. If you went into the water, you went into the water. If you didn't, you didn't. So my love, what it must mean is that if you didn't have intention when you went in, then it's kilo lo taval klal. What it's saying is that you didn't go into the mikvah at all. It says we're low. What it's saying is if you didn't have intention, kilo lo taval ma'aser. It's as if you didn't get a tefillah for ma'aser, where did you need intention? Aval taval lechulin. But again, the opinion that I maintain throughout, which is the Yehuda Marav's opinion, is that you don't need intention for a mikvah and tahara of chulin. Now, who's Savar? He thought, right? Rava thought that Rav Nachman was just a chulika. Rav Nachman was sort of just giving him a hard time and was just pushing him off, and he wasn't really of the opinion that this was the psak. But Nafak Dach ve'eshkach, Rava went and he went, to the library and he looked it up and he found a Braita which said exactly that. The Tanya, the Braita, explained the Mishnah in Chagiga as Tava v'lo huchsak. If you go into the mikvah but you didn't do it with the intention of becoming tahar, mutar lechulin v'asur l'maaser. Then you are allowed to eat chulin because you went to a mikvah, but you are asur for maaser. So that is how Rabbi Rav had paskined. So said Abaye to Rabbi Yosef, once they found this Braita, Amalei Abaye to Rabbi Yosef, Lemit Havet Yufta to Rabbi Yochanan Meha. Rabbi Yochanan, who said that a tahara and a mikvah requires intention even for chulin, this Braita very explicitly says that you don't need to, right? That if you go into a mikvah, you're tahar for chulin, even though you had no intention. So this seems to be a tiyufta of Rabbi Yochanan. Amalei, Rabbi Yochanan, who damak Rabbi Yonatan Yosef. Rabbi Yochanan argues with that Tana because he has another Tana. So again, Amor doesn't argue with the Tana usually, but if you have another Tana that supports you, Rabbi Yochanan in fact has another Tana, like Rabbi Yochanan, Yonatan ben Yosef. Sorry, we're I guess exactly halfway down Lamed Aleph Bet, where Tosafot has the word upeirot, right? So we're right. He holds like Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef, the Tanya, as we learned in a brisa. Amar Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef Omer. It says, we mentioned this a little bit yesterday, it says by a mitzora, not this part actually, it says by a mitzora v'chubas, right? You have to wash the clothing after the week of being in Hesker, right? So you see something in clothing, you put it away for a week, and then after the end of the week, you wash it. So now, Matam Alomer Shenit. Why does it say you wash it a second time at the end of the week? We can count. Do you wash it at the beginning of the week, and you wash it at the end of the week? You washed it twice. Says Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef, who's a Tana, Makish techboset shniya techboset rishona. The pasuk is clearly comparing the second washing to the first washing. Ma techboset rishona ladat. Just like when you do it the first time, you're doing it with the intention of you're doing it with the Kohen for tzarat. After techboset shniya ladat. So too, the second techboset has to be done intentionally. Meaning, if you took a mistake and you forgot that the shirt was tzarat and you put in the laundry and you wash it, it doesn't count. You have to wash it intentionally for the purposes of tzarat. So that's what you see from the pasuk. Says the Gemara, or I guess it's probably the brightest still. Imala halam bina dat kohen, afkam bina dat kohen. if you're comparing the second washing to the first one had to be done under the auspices of a Kohen. So maybe the second one also needs to be done under the auspices of a Kohen. Talmud Amar v'taher. Therefore, we say the word v'taher mikol makom, that you don't need a Kohen for the second one. But at least what you do see, though, from this Braita, from Yonatan ben Yosef, is that even when things are not kachim, because tzarat is not kachim, right? It's chulin to become tahar to wear your shirt again. You need to have that, and so the pasuk by tzarat teaches us that even for chulin, you need to have dat in order for something to become washed and tahar in a mikveh. So that's what Rabbi Yochanan will rely on. Says Gematkif or Rashi. Rashi said, 1 second. How in the world could you say that? Miyam Rabbi Yochanan hachi? Does Rabbi Yochanan say that you need to have dat? Rabbi Yochanan halacha stam mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan always relies on a stam mishnah. If you find a stam mishnah that implies something different, Rabbi Yochanan always goes that way. But it's none. And now, this is why we quoted the last Amud, our Mishnah. What did our Mishnah say? It's none. You get to our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah said, where are we? First word on the line, around 20 lines from the bottom. Our Mishnah said, Nafla sakin v'shachata. If a knife fell and was shochet, slaughtered an animal on its way down, even though it killed an animal, shechted an animal on its way, on its flight path, psula, right? The shechita is pasul. Avinaba, and we asked, time nafla, right? Asked, maybe Avina is a strong language. Avina means we discussed, right? We had Shakta V'Tarya about the Mishnah, that the Mishnah's only reason it's pasul in the Mishnah is because it's nafla, because the knife fell, maybe on its own, maybe pushed by someone, but without the intention of it falling. Ha hitpilahi kshera. If the person had dropped the knife, even if they didn't have intention to do shchita, afa gavdolo mechavein, even though they didn't have intention to do shchita. And we said yes earlier today, as well as earlier in the Masechta, man tan boy kavana l'shchita. Who is a Tana who doesn't need kavanah for shchita? Amar Rava Rabbi Natan. Rabbi Rava told us a few times already that it's Rabbi Natan, right? So you see clearly from this Stam Mishnah that we had today that you don't need to have intention, right? Now it's not kachim, of course, so it's chulin, and the knife dropped. The knife was thrown, but without the intention of doing shchita. A Stam Mishnah says it's a kosher shchita. So you see from our Mishnah that if you do actions for chulin without intention, they count as your action. So how can Rabbi Yochanan argue about a mikvah and about Tara? Our Mishnah is pretty clear that the Stam Mishnah is that you don't need to have intention to do the act. You just need to have intention to throw the thing, but not to accomplish it. Says the Gemara, "B'shchita afilu Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef modi." By shchita, remember Rabbi Yochanan relied on the Tana, Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef, but Rabbi Yonatan ben Yosef would admit that shchita is an exception. Why? Midigali rachmana mit asik bekachim. Pasul. Since the Torah taught us, and we learned this earlier from a pasuk of Vishachat l'ratzoncha, I think, that you have to shet l'ratzon, that you have to have intention in kachim. It means, well, by kachim you have to have intention with shchita, mechlal dechulin lo boi kavana. But by chulin, you don't need to have kavana in shchita. So there's a separate, basically, limud by shchita that means you don't have to have intention, but that does not teach us that by mikvah and tara you don't need to have intention. Rabbanan, and the Rabbanan would say, it's true. You don't need to have kavanah for the act of shchita, but you have to have kavanah for cutting the neck of the animal, right? So throwing a knife at a wall is not enough, because we're throwing, according to this opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, throwing a knife, you just want to throw the knife. You don't want to cut anything. You have to have intention to cut something, right? But you don't necessarily have to have intention to do a shchita. And that is the difference between kachim and chulin. Amar Rava, says Rava, that's a little bit far-fetched. I would say, says Rava, very interesting language of Rava, V'ha zachanu Rabbi Natan Rabbanan. In this way, Rabbi Natan succeeded against the Chachamim. Remember, Rabbi Natan says you don't need kavanah for shchita. Chachamim said you do. Rabbi Natan seems to be correct because michte v'chatachta doesn't say, right. The Rabbanan's whole contention is that when it says by kadshim that you have to have intention, implying by chulin you don't have to have intention, it's because you have to have intention for cutting, right? Says Rabbi Natan, did it really say cut? V'zavachtachtiv. It said the word v'zavachta. If you need to have intention, according to the Chachamim, to cut the animal's neck, you need to have intention to shech the animal. If you don't need to have kavana for zvicha, you don't need to have kavana for cutting. And therefore, says Rava, I don't find that explanation compelling at all. And my opinion is that in regards to shchita, at least, it's very clear that by shchita of chulin, you don't need to have intention to shech the animal or cut the animal. You just need to have intention to throw the knife and want it to be falling. And so that is Rabbi Natan's opinion, and that is what Rava seems to think is very compelling. And that's really the conclusion of that. Now, before we finish today's daf, we're not quite done. We made really good time. We are around 8 lines from the bottom. Ask the Gemara, Hechi dami nida shenensa v'tavla. Right? We had this whole case earlier of a woman who's a nida who was forced to go to the mikveh. And so we said earlier, she's tahar lebeita, she's no longer a mikveh, a nida, sorry, but she's not allowed to eat truma, right? Because you have to have intention for a tefillah for truma. Now, what's the case? What does that mean she was forced and put into a mikveh? Ilema de ansa chaverta v'atbla. Maybe her friends grabbed her and said, "You have to go to the mikveh. We don't like whatever reason she wasn't going to the mikveh," and they threw her in a mikveh. Says the Gemara, but that's not a problem. Then she's kosher because although she didn't want to go in the mikveh, the people putting her in the mikveh wanted her to go there. Kavanah de chaverta, kavanah ma'ayotehi. The kavanah of her friends, her friend, is counts as kavanah, and we have a mission that says that because in that case, od truma nami achla, she would be allowed to eat truma in that case because even remember for truma you need to have intention, but someone else wanting you to go in the mikveh, it counts as intention. Ditznan, we have a Mishnah, Mesachet Nida, which is a very interesting Mishnah. What do you do about people who are not considered to be bardat? Let's say you have a woman who has a menstrual period, right? So she's tameh, but she's a chareshet, right? She's deaf or mute, deaf mute, which in those times they couldn't be educated, or shoteh, or she has a mental illness that she's not aware, or soma, or she's blind, so she's not educated. She she has usually means like bipolar. She's like a psychological crisis. In Yesh Lahem Pikhot Mitaknotutam, if you have regular, competent people who can prepare them and make sure they're kosher for the mikvah and help them go in the mikvah, then ochlot b'truma, then that mikvah counts, and those women can eat truma even though they're nida, right? Which is obviously very important. They're going to menstruate. That happens anyways, and so they can do this with the guidance of someone else. So if a woman's friends threw her into a mikvah, that counts as a kosher mikvah. Amar Rav Papa says, Rav Papa, you're right. What Rabbi Natan, according to Rabbi Natan, the case would have to be Shenaflam and Hagesher. She had no intention of going in the water. She was walking on a bridge over the river and she fell off the bridge and she wasn't wearing clothing, right? And so she went into the mikveh because you don't need any intention. Rabbanan, remember Rabbanan said you need some intention, like you have to throw the knife. She yarda lahaker. It's where she went in to cool herself. So basically, it was a hot day. She went swimming. She had no intention of going to the mikveh to be retired from her nida. According to Kvish Rabbi Natan, that's fine. It doesn't matter. As long as you're intending to go in the water, that would be okay. But according to Rabbanan, if you don't intend to go in as a nida, that would be a problem and you would be tahor to your house, but tameh to eat, not tameh, but yeah, usher to eat truma. So we'll stop there. Hopefully people don't fall off bridges too often, and pick it up, God willing, tomorrow from the next part. Thank you for joining. Have a great week, everyone. Miriam, we hope you're
Thank
feeling
you.
well. Fuah Shlema.
Thank you.
Bye.